Call is now being recorded.
Okay, I think we're good.
All right.
Okay, so first question's an easy one. How old were you during the Vietnam War, roughly?
Oh my, that was, let me see, I might have to figure out a little bit on that. Okay, that was, okay. Okay, now the Vietnam War started in 1955 and ended in 1975. So in 1955, I would have been 18 in 1955. And then, of course, 20 years later, I would have been 28.
So, like, roughly your 20s was how old you were during that time?
Yes.
Okay. So, what do you remember life being like during the war? Like, do you have any, like, outstanding memories?
Yes. Two that come to mind initially, there were a lot of marches and a lot of people protesting against the Vietnam War. And that's one of the things that I remember, that there was a lot of opposition to the Vietnam War. I remember that some people tried to avoid being drafted, and they did this. Some people even went to Canada so that they could not be drafted. And then there were organizations that helped people to legally avoid getting drafted. Those are two things I remember. And a third thing that I remember, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out against the Vietnam War. And as you know, he had a lot of moral leadership, and he was a Christian man and a civil rights leader. And he spoke out very forcefully against the Vietnam War. He did not think that it was a just war. Oh, and a fourth thing I remember is that Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted because he said the Viet Cong had never called him a bad name, and he did not feel that he should go and fight against them for whatever reasons that he could not understand. And he did not think
Right.
that there was a legitimate reason. Those are some of the things that I remember about the Vietnam War.
So I know that Vietnam also took place during the Civil Rights Movement. So, like, do you remember what race relations were like during that time period?
Yes, the Civil Rights Movement, they generally think about that as being during the 1960s. And some people call that the Second Reconstruction. Of course, the first Reconstruction was right after the Civil War. And during the Civil Rights Movement, I remember that very well. One of the big issues in the Civil Rights Movement was of course, the overriding issue was segregation. And one of the places that there was a lot of segregation was in housing. Another place that there was a lot of discrimination was in public accommodations. For example, you could not stay at hotels, and in a lot of places, people of color were not allowed to sit down and eat at restaurants. And of course, the sit-in movement started. And I can tell you a lot more about the civil rights movement if you want more. And one thing I will tell you, and if I go too long on an answer, let me know, because I know you have a lot of questions to cover. But during the time of the civil rights movement, of course, I had become an adult at that time. I think I did go back. Well, yes, I did go back down south to visit I think during that period of time, and of course before that time, my family used to go to visit your grandmother,
Mhm.
and myself and the rest of our family used to go down south to visit, and of course, when the Vietnam War started in 1955, things were still very segregated, especially in the South. Of course, there was segregation in the North also, but for the most part, the legal segregation, there was more of it in the South than in the North. And we used to travel down south by car, and and then when we would travel, we were not allowed to go into restaurants and eat, and we were not allowed to use the bathrooms at a lot of the gas stations where we would stop to buy gas. So we would have to take our food with us. My parents, my mother would prepare lunch. We would take with us in the car, and we would eat in the car. And of course, that was before the interstates were built also, and it was about a 24-hour trip. And when we wanted to sleep, we just have to pull over on the side of the road and sleep in the car. And the adults would have to take turns sleeping because somebody would have to stay awake to make sure that nobody came to do us any harm. And we would be traveling from Ohio to Alabama, so that means we traveled through Kentucky and Tennessee. And when we needed to go to the bathroom, we would just have to go to the bathroom on the side of the road. So those are some of the things I remember about the about the segregation, and the reason that it was so necessary to have the civil rights movement, because as you know, African American people are citizens of the United States. They are entitled to all of the rights and privileges of citizens of the United States, just as everyone else is entitled. And the civil rights movement was necessary in many instances to enforce the rights that were already given to us by the Constitution of the United States.
Do you remember if, like, Black citizens, like, felt, like, similar to Muhammad Ali, like they didn't really want to fight because America was still not treating them like first-class citizens?
Okay, wait, I didn't understand that question. Could you repeat it?
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't understand what you were saying.
Would you say that, like, a lot of people in the Black community, like, agreed or disagreed with Muhammad Ali's mindset of the war? Like, they never did anything to me, and America's not treating me right, so why would I fight in the war?
Oh, I think a lot of people agreed with him. At least a lot of the people that I knew agreed with him.
Did, like, a lot of people disagree? Or was it pretty much like...
I don't personally remember talking to people who disagreed. I'm sure that there were people who disagreed, but I do not personally remember associates of mine who disagreed. But of course, there were people speaking in the news who were being interviewed and who were speaking in the news who disagreed with him. But as I said, at this time right now, I really do not personally remember people who were associates of mine who disagreed with him.
Right. Let me see. So would you say at the time, like, you agreed or disagreed with Muhammad Ali's mindset?
Oh, I agreed with him because I believe that as I said, that African American citizens are citizens of the United States, and that they have all the rights and privileges of everyone else. And I
Mhm.
believe that the concept that Dr. King had, that when you are coming up to an unjust law, you have a moral obligation to oppose that law. And
Mhm.
I believed that that's what Muhammad Ali was doing, that he was opposing what he considered to be an unjust law. And of course, as a part of that philosophy, you have to be willing to take the punishment. So that meant that he had to be able and willing to take the punishment that came along with disobeying an unjust law.
Right. So I guess like this would be a good time to ask this question. So, how would you describe your views on the Vietnam War as it was going on?
Well, I believed that the war was not a just war, and I never really understood why the United States felt that it should be fighting in Vietnam. I never really understood that, and actually, I still don't really understand it. And I really think that it was an unjust war, and I just thought it was that it was not that it was not an appropriate war, and I think it's very, very bad to send young men to fight and to die for unjust causes. It's bad enough when you have to die for what you consider to be a just cause, but to have to die for something you consider to be an unjust cause, I think that's very, very bad. And there were a lot of young men who, as you know, I'm sure you've come across it in your
Mhm.
report, the number of people who died, and then the
Yeah.
number of people who were injured, and and especially those who suffered from that post-traumatic stress syndrome and other illnesses that they suffered from. And one of the really, really
Right.
bad situations, a lot of people, from my reading, and of course I don't know, from all, I haven't really researched all of the statistics, but from my reading and even from some personal observations, I think that a lot of people ended up drug addicts as a result of having served in Vietnam.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy.
Yes.
Um, do you know any black men that served during Vietnam? And if so, like, did they ever share their experience with you?
I can remember the one who I understood got addicted to drugs there. Well, in fact,
Mm.
another one, and I remember the one who talked about how difficult it was having to do the things that they had to do. Those are two that come to my mind right away.
Do you
The
know
one
if they
who
like chose to serve or if they were drafted?
they were drafted. Yeah, they were drafted.
Oh.
The one that who was addicted to drugs, I can't. Who told me? I mean, who I understood from reliable sources became addicted to drugs there. I really can't
Wow.
remember exactly what his job was there, but the first one I mentioned, but the second one I mentioned, I think he had the job of I think he said tagging dead bodies or something like that, something to
Oh
do
no.
with dealing with dead bodies, and he ended up being a drug addict also. Those are the two who come to mind right away. I'm sure there were others I knew, but I just can't think of them right now.
That's okay. Do you remember like what black people in the media were saying about the war, or like what they thought of it?
I really don't remember offhand too much about what was in the black media about the war, other than the things that I've already discussed. I mean, I don't
Mhm.
remember editorials about it, but the things that I've mentioned, they, they would have been covered in the black media. And of course,
Right.
the overall one of the themes is that it's just ironic especially when there was still so much segregation and discrimination here in the United States against black people, and then for the black soldiers to have to go over there and fight against something that many of them felt were that it was an unjust war. It was just it just was what I consider hypocritical.
Right.
And of course World War II had ended about 10 years before the Vietnam War started, but that was an especially bad situation. The black soldiers were still treated very, very badly, and the armed forces were not desegregated until 1948. So during they had been desegregated by the time of the Vietnam War, as I gave you that quote before.
Mhm.
That George Washington's army was the most integrated military force of any of the American military forces up until the Vietnam War about 200 years later. So when World War II went on from 1941 to 1945, there was just wholesale segregation and just really, really bad discrimination against black soldiers in the armed services, and
Right.
many of them came back to this country, like even those who had been in D-Day, and then they came back to this country. In fact, Medgar Evers was one of those who had fought in D-Day, and he went back to
Mhm.
Mississippi that was so very, very segregated. And then there are instances like, for example, Congressman Louis Stokes here in Cleveland and others who had the experience after World War II of traveling with German prisoners of war in this country, and they would come to a restaurant where the German prisoners of war would be served and the black soldiers would not be served.
Mhm. Wow. So, in general, would you say that would you say that people viewed the Vietnam War as more important than the Civil Rights Movement, or would
You
you say
say,
vice versa?
oh no, I wouldn't. I don't think they viewed it as more important. No, I would not say that they viewed it as more important, because the civil rights movement was so very basic to everyday life, and even affecting the situations and the soldiers who were in the Vietnam War. So I would not say that it was more important. No, the civil rights movement was extremely important, and I just want everybody to understand two things. African Americans, as I said before, are citizens of the United States, and they are entitled to all the rights and privileges. They
Mhm.
should not be subjected to discrimination. And people of the United States need to realize that without African Americans, the United States would not even exist in the form that it does exist in today. So there are a lot of debts of gratitude owed to African Americans that a lot of people really do not understand.
Mhm. Let's see. Um. Yeah, that's about it. So one more time. So in general, would you say like the people, like the black people you were around during the time, were they like for or against the war?
Well, my associates for the most part, I believe, were against the war, and I can remember people who were involved. You know, I mentioned before that there were organizations that helped to inform young men how to legally avoid being drafted, and I remember I did know some of the people involved in those movements too. I heard of people going to Canada to avoid being drafted, but I personally did not know anybody who did that. But I did know persons who were in these organizations that helped people to do things that were legal in order to avoid the draft.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Aunt Daisy. Like, I really appreciate you doing this for me.
Well, you're quite welcome, Jasmine. And I did email a photograph to your mother this morning, my photograph.
Oh, we got it.
Okay, because I didn't have your email address. So, as I had stated before, since you wanted to do a photo interview, I said, well, sometimes on television programs, they'll just have the audio and they'll just show the photo. So I sent the photo and I told you on there. And of course, I am your great aunt. I am the sister of your grandmother, and I am a retired attorney. Well, actually, I'm still an attorney, but I'm not actively practicing, but I'm still an attorney licensed by the state of Ohio, and I am a retired federal administrative law judge, and I have the privilege of being Jasmine Williams' great aunt.
Aww.
All right, and I'm honored that you asked me to do this interview with you, Jasmine.
Oh yeah, you're one of the first people.
It appears that you are a very good student, and I ask you to please keep up the good work. Always remember, knowledge is power, and always remember you do have a duty to become educated. And you know that during the time of slavery, it was a crime for our enslaved ancestors to learn to read and write. And the fact that it was a crime indicates how important learning to read and write is. So always remember, knowledge is power. You have a duty to learn. Learn everything that you can, and it will be very beneficial to you. And I can tell you, there were a lot of courses I took in school and didn't think that they would be worthwhile, but I think I can truthfully say that almost every course I ever took in school has been worthwhile.
All right. Well, I will continue to do well in school, Aunt Daisy.
All right. Thank you so much, Jasmine. If you have any more questions, feel free to call me, and I'm so proud of you. It looks like you did a very thorough job, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome, and I will talk with you later.
All right,
unless you have any more questions.